Thank you for inviting me. First thing I want to say is really to give praise to the Parliament for the excellent work it's doing on DSM. I think particularly the report has been tremendously valuable and timely. It's been a lot of work that you have put into giving your views on the DSM and the key priorities, but it's been very, very helpful and very useful from our perspective, and your leadership will be needed as we start putting further proposals on the table. And typically I start with some kind of, I always like to start with substance, but in this case I think it's maybe not so bad to start with some process elements. I think first of all, yes, we've been discussing platforms for quite some time now, but I think the discussion is more mature than it was, say, only 6 months ago. I think we're reaching a higher level. It's more sophisticated. It's a little less kind of from the gut. It is a bit more thought through. And I think the fact that we're having these discussions, the fact that the Commission has put a public consultation out, actually asking precise questions, has forced people to think about regulating, for example, platform. What would it mean? How would you do it? So I think we're making progress in that sense, and that is good. The Commission yesterday established its planning for the next 6 months. I think it's also useful to bear that in mind, and it has announced a communication on platforms for the 1st of June, and also some guidance on, we discussed the Uberization and Uber, some guidance on the collaborative economy. There's a whole set actually of packages coming in the next couple of months, starting in April with the digitization of industry package, and then maybe I should take you through it. In May there's geo-blocking, and there's parcel delivery, and there's a modification of the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network, so small package there. Then on the 1st of June, Audiovisual Media Services Directive, plus a communication on platforms and guidance on the collaborative economy. 22nd of June, the modernization of copyright. And then in September, it's telecom. So there's a whole load of work coming to the Parliament and to the Council, and that's no doubt of interest to you, but we're discussing platforms this evening. I was told in 5 minutes. Typically as a Commission, if you intervene in the Parliament discussion, you get 4 minutes, and I'm very scared of that clock that just goes down and down and down, so I'll try to stick to the 5 minutes, but it may be a little more, but I'm going to be as kind of short as possible. So that's, I think, on the process. And frankly, on definitions, and regulation, this is entirely the wrong question. It's not because we can define certain phenomena that we regulate. Public policy you regulate because there's a problem, and then we regulate at the EU level because we believe the EU level is best placed to address that problem. So it's very interesting from an academic point of view, but it's completely irrelevant from a public policy point of view whether or not we can find the perfect definition that captures all platforms, because that's exactly the problem. Not all platforms are alike. So I think that's the first issue. I think the second issue is should we regulate platforms is also completely the wrong question. Let's think about what's happening in the economy. We see platforms, they're there, they continue to exist, they won't go away, they will only increase in importance. We know what they're doing in, say, areas of social media. Think of industry, digitization of industry. Think of the possibility to disintermediate the connected car, for example, Internet of Things. There can be platforms that kind of can disintermediate. Great, developing new services. It's all very positive, efficiency gains, etc. But the value accrues at the level of the platforms generally. And so we want in Europe to be high up in the value chain. We just don't want to be the dumb pipes and providing the infrastructure. We want to capture an important part of the value. So the question is, how can we make sure that Europe provides the conditions for European platforms to grow? And of course to be in competition with platforms from wherever they come in the world, but not to hold platforms from wherever they come in the world back, because we have failed to put in place in Europe the conditions for our own platforms to grow. So the first question is, how can we put in place the conditions for our own platforms to grow? And again, the answer is the digital single market, because platforms network effects, data, scale and speed. If we have fragmented markets in the European Union, we should not be surprised that we don't have successful platforms in the European Union, because simply they cannot scale up fast enough. So I think those are the relevant questions that we are asking ourselves in the Commission. We recognize the very positive effects of platforms, and even if they were negative, they're not going to go away, so you better deal with them if there are issues. So we want them to be pro-competitive, pro-innovation and pro-consumer. Often I hear, because I deal with platforms in the European Commission, so what are you going to do on platforms? And the answer is we're doing a lot on platforms, but not because they are platforms, but simply because when we look at particular policy areas, the platform issue is a relevant issue. I mean, this Parliament adopted the Network and Information Security Directive. One of the issues that came up was the role of digital service providers as platforms in the context of information and network security. I mean, we're looking at a whole range of policy areas at the moment as part of the DSM. In almost every policy instrument, the question of platforms is relevant. We're looking at telecoms in the whole telecoms review, the competition with over-the-tops, particularly when they kind of engage in similar services, is relevant. It's a relevant question. It's a level playing field question. We're looking at audiovisual media services. The issue of platforms is very relevant. A lot of content, audiovisual content, is made available and kind of enjoyed through platforms. So we have regulation applying to broadcasters. We have limited regulation providing to the kind of the video on demand type operations, and we have no legislation, at least not under the AVMS, Audiovisual Media Service Directive, applying to, say, the intermediaries where you have the user-generated content. So we need to look. Is it still relevant to have certain obligations on our broadcasters when they are in direct competition, particularly for advertising, with those who are not under the same obligations? So those are very relevant questions. We have questions about protection of minors, incitement to hatred. It's extremely relevant to ask the question, look, is the approach that we have been pursuing for the last number of years, is that still the right approach? In the context of copyright, platforms play a very important role because they tend to distribute a lot of copyrighted material. So the question, which we tend to summarize as value gap, is a very important question. Geo-blocking, of course, it's about platforms, it's about platform behavior. So there's a lot of kind of issues that we're now looking at from a perspective of level playing field. Kind of, do we need to deregulate in some of the areas that we have been regulating? Do we need to regulate up to ensure that the public policy considerations are met? So the question is not should we or should we not look at platforms with a view to regulation. We're looking at platforms with a view to regulation because they are relevant in a number of areas where the European Union has regulated. And the outcome could be we regulate less where we have regulated in the past, or the outcome could be we shift a little bit of the regulatory burden onto platforms, and that case has to be made. And that's why we're doing impact assessment, that's why we're doing consultation. Well, then there are a number of issues which are in a way new, although nothing is entirely new. Where we're looking, we also ask questions in the public consultation. The public consultation, which ran from September until actually the beginning and early of January, yielded more than 1,000 contributions, 1,050. We actually got 11,000 responses from an organization I had never heard from, nor of in Canada, which had kind of amassed a lot of kind of citizens' comments, and then they send that to us as their input. But it's easy because they're all the same. So 11,000 is actually one times 11,000. But the comments we got from 27 member states, very insightful. We got a lot of comments, obviously, from the platforms, from the industry using the platforms themselves. We got a lot of academic input from consumer organizations. So a very rich palette of views which we are now digesting. So it is too early to say what the Commission will conclude. The conclusions will be in this document that the Commission intends to adopt on the 1st on the 1st of June. But I think in general, a lot of recognition about the positive effects of platforms and a number of areas which are kind of highlighted as areas where public policy makers need to take a more careful look. One is transparency. Are they sufficiently transparent? We know the Google case about search results and what influences the search results. Why does something pop up first, and maybe there's a link here with some payment that has been made. So there's an issue there. The review issue is a relevant issue. I mean, I agree with Brian that I don't go into a restaurant and a hotel without first checking TripAdvisor, so there's a lot of benefit and say empowerment of consumers, but there are also situations where you can actually you can pay and you get a positive review, or you can pay and then they remove a positive review, or even if you're a restaurant owner, you can have all positive reviews about your own restaurant and nobody cares or nobody checks. So some kind of indication to consumers to what extent they can rely on this information is a legitimate public policy question. So this is in the area of transparency. Another area that has come up and we're looking at is the area which I would call fairness. We have unfair commercial practices legislation in the European Union. So if you're a consumer, you should not be confronted with abusive contract clauses. We have some indications, but we need to build up the evidence that in the relation between big platforms and the small providers, there might be instances of unfair contractual clauses where the platform, for example, says you can only sell on my platform. Don't think about selling to anybody else. You need to give me the exclusivity on my own platform. That is something we're looking at, and obviously there are competition aspects as well. The third is a very critical issue, is the issue of interoperability and data portability. We put some questions there, very complicated, no obvious answers, but certainly issues, and in some areas like in cloud is maybe easier to address, to port your data from one cloud provider to another cloud provider, because that's clearly pro-competitive. Nobody wants to be locked in. But in some areas, when it's, say, your data on Facebook, how that should be ported is much more complicated, and where you also need to think about business models, you need to think about IPR, you need to think about data protection considerations. So there are a number of issues that have come out of the consultation where certainly further analysis and reflection is necessary, but I think our main focus at the moment is to look at the sectoral areas and to make sure that we strike the right balance in terms of, say, the obligations that we impose on, say, the traditional providers and the obligations that may need or may not need to be imposed on the new providers. And the tendency will always be to try to deregulate rather than to regulate even more. And then, of course, and that's the most important question, is how can we make sure, particularly in the industry where we have so much strength, we have very strong manufacturing industry in Europe, that the platforms which are going to come are going to benefit, that there's also European platforms that can grow and become European and global success stories. So that is what the emphasis needs to be on, the whole issue about definition and just more general questions of regulate or not regulate are questions which are interesting in academia, but far less interesting in public policy.